All right, thank you, everybody. It's a bit strange for me to do the same session just 2 years later, but so much has changed, it just seemed like a good thing to do. Now, before I go any further, this title's kind of crazy. VP of Product Evangelism. That's just living proof you do not let your business partner pick your title when you're at a trade show in Europe. I used to be the VP of product management, but as we've grown and we have more products now, that ended up being given to somebody else, so they came up with this for me, but I had no vote. Also, I'm kind of a strange person to be in the world of technical writing. For those who don't know me, my education is actually in physics. But I found out way back in the 1980s, if you work at a nuclear power plant, and you're the person that complains the most about how bad the reactor plant manuals are, they put you in charge of the technical publications library. And that sent me off on a whole new career direction. I didn't even know it was called technical writing. I just know that somebody, me, now is in charge of writing hundreds of procedures. And of course, nuclear power being so popular in the US, I only did that for a short time, and then I moved into semiconductors. And that's where I actually got involved in less technical writing and more in just technical communication, because that's something else I found in my career. I can't spell. So I'm a technical communicator. I need a good editor. So I've been in this world pretty much ever since. All right, so that's how a crazy physics guy ends up in technical documentation. All right, now why am I doing a newer version of this presentation? Well, something major happened. And let's talk about responsive content. That's kind of an industry phrase, but what does that even mean? Well, it's talking about how can I write content one time, but it now works for anybody. And we could do that a few years ago, but it was a lot of work. And some new changes through the World Wide Web Consortium have made it so much easier now. So what we're going to look at is just what is responsive design. Start with a definition. We'll look at the core components of responsive design, document structure, the cascading style sheet language, and media queries. Then we're going to look at responsive design strategy, and this is really the part that has changed. And while a lot of sessions today have been kind of heavy on the theory and the concepts, once we get to this bullet, my goal is to give you something you could actually take home and use on Monday if you want to, some actual techniques. In fact, before we go any further, I should probably ask, how many of you have some part in the presentation of your content? I know in some companies, all you do is write and somebody else takes care of presentation and styling and formatting. How many people have some input on that presentation? Oh, quite a few. All right, how many of you wish you were better at cascading style sheets? Okay, yeah, I'll be honest, all of us. The good news, this part used to be crazy hard. It's so much easier now. All right, so I'm kind of teasing too much. Let's jump right in. So what is responsive design? Well, there's a great paper by Ethan Marcotte. You can't jot that down, but when this gets replayed, you can slow it down. But it was written quite a while ago and it's still out there. And what Ethan came up with was this concept of stress points. Now, it's actually kind of outdated, the way we think of responsive design today. But if you go all the way back, what people were doing is they were saying, okay, I need a version of my content that runs in a web browser, and I need a version of my content that works on an iPhone. And they were separate. And what Ethan said is that's silly. What we should do is write content and present it one time, and if the screen starts to get smaller, at some point it doesn't work anymore, he calls that a stress point. And we should be able to change the presentation at that point. Now, 15 years ago, that was amazing. 10 years ago, whenever it was written. The problem with it, it's not optimized. It's like the content is great. Okay, it's good. It's okay. Oh, now it's ugly. Let's change it. So this idea of stress points, it's not flexible enough by today's standards. All right, so what responsive design is not, it's not a smaller version of your page. If you've ever seen a page on your phone where you have to zoom in, zoom back out, pan, zoom in, yeah, making it microscopic isn't responsive design. Or my favorite, removing content to fit. If you've ever pulled up a page in your full web browser and it's 10 paragraphs, and you pull it up on your phone and it's 3 paragraphs, that's not responsive design. And it's not having an iPhone version and a web browser version. So what it is, like I said earlier, a single version delivered to your customer in a way that is easily understood no matter what device they're reading your content on. That could be a phone, a tablet, a computer, a refrigerator, anything that has a screen these days. So that is the purpose of responsive design. All right, so those core components, and time's already getting away from me, we're going to speed up. So document structure. I would hope this audience is already comfortable with the whole idea that we're going to separate content and formatting. The second piece is the CSS. The third piece, the media queries. So document structure first. Less is more. In other words, we keep all formatting out of the page completely. No more hidden tables. Not anybody in this room is guilty of that. You want a page to look like this, so what you do is you sneak a hidden table in there. Yeah, that worked 20 years ago. We don't do that anymore. That ruins any responsive design capabilities. So no more inline formatting of any kind. The reason we do want to semantically mark up our documents, I don't want to make this 14-point Arial bold. I want this to be a heading 1. I don't want this to be a fancy font in a different, I want this to be a note. What the note looks like, we control in the style sheet. So the second leg of the responsive design stool is the cascading style sheet. And it still amazes me how many people are afraid of the cascading style sheet language. It's really not that hard. You can learn most of it in a single weekend if you just study. Now, it can take a lifetime to master it, but the basics can be learned in one weekend. And we can control our block level elements, our character level elements, and our formatting or our grouping level elements. So as we're authoring our content, it should just look ugly. We want it to look ugly. Because then when we apply the style sheet, well, that's when the headings and the formatting and the notes should all kick in. Without the style sheet, it should look like this. That's how you know you've done it correctly. We've separated the content and the formatting. All right, now finally, media queries. The first generation of responsive design. This is what I talked about the last time I was here. It was part of the CSS3 specification, which was still relatively new 2 years ago, derived from the old media types, and it provides for a way in a style sheet to test the display device. What is its size? What is its resolution? What's its pixel density? And then we can dynamically adjust the presentation automatically. The problem with media queries, they're scary, they're technical. You really have to understand the cascading style sheet language to be able to write these things. As that whole screen, all that does is changes the background color. If it's a small screen, it's yellow. If it's like a tablet, it's red. And if it's a computer, it's green. But it takes all of those media queries to do that. That was in the beginning. All right, so those are kind of the three foundational pieces. Now there's kind of a strategy component, where the style sheet is designed to control content like notes or paragraphs. We actually want to think about what we publish as far as regions or areas, almost like a grid. How do I want to say this? The thing to remember, though, is this is not something you let marketing decide. This is really about content and relationships. So if somebody's on a large display, like a computer monitor, well, maybe this is the relationship that I want. I want a header area and 3 content areas. Now, each of those content areas could be a mixture of subheadings, graphics, lists, whatever I want, but maybe it takes a full screen. What happens on a tablet? Well, by doing grouping like this, we can realign all through the style sheet. And if we get on a small device like a phone, well, now we can stagger vertically. So that's kind of one of the strategies that goes with those 3 components. Okay, those 3 techniques are how we're going to do the control, but we have to think about our content in kind of a grouping or a grid fashion. All right, so that was pretty much the short version of everything I presented in 2016. If you want to dig into more details of any of that, that recording is up on the SOAP YouTube channel. So if you need those foundations, they're up there. But now we're going to move forward. So phase 1, we talked about those breakpoints. It relied on media queries. Lots of CSS. It was really confusing. It worked, but it was painful. That was kind of the first generation of responsive design. Phase 2, this was cutting edge stuff in 2016. Frameworks. Anybody here ever use Google Bootstrap or the Zerp Foundation layer? All right, you guys know what I'm talking about. Instead of writing all of that crazy media query code, we could rely on somebody else to pre-write a lot of that code for us. And most of them use the magic number 12. Now, why the number 12? Why not 10? Well, 12 is kind of a unique number. It divides into some really neat units. If I want content to be half the width of the screen, that's a 6. If I want my content to be 1/3 of the width of the screen, that's a 4. So basically all we did there is we took a typical page and we split it into 12 columns. So instead of dealing with pixels or anything like that anymore, it's just how wide do I want something? I tell it how many grids that I want. And that's what's neat about 12. It divides so many different ways. The other neat thing about those foundations is where media queries, you had to write a lot of them. It's as simple as if it's a large screen, I want 4, 4, 4. If it's a small screen, I want 12, 12, 12. So if it's a large screen, I want my content areas to go side by side. But if it's a small screen like a phone, I want each area to be the full width, and they'll stack vertically. So much easier than those individual media queries. All right, so here's an example. I have a couple of divs here. and small 12, medium 4. That's it. That's all the code I have to write instead of those long media queries. And so now, if it's a small device, 12 means full width, and it stacks. But then if I go onto a tablet, a medium device, well, 4, 4, 4. Each of my content areas is 1/3 of the screen. So that was huge. But it gets even better now. So now we go to phase 3. Has anybody here had a chance to experiment with FlexBox? Well, 3 hands? Come on, this is awesome. All right, FlexBox is relatively new. Actually, it's been around in a experimental or recommendation stage for a long time. The big key thing was Internet Explorer finally supporting it. So now it's at a point where it's fairly safe to use out in the wild. The other neat thing is its native CSS functionality. As good as Google Bootstrap was, or Zerb Foundation, those were third-party technologies. It's not like those were officially endorsed by the World Wide Web Consortium. They were kind of filling a gap. This is actually official World Wide Web Consortium technology, which is always nice. But the best part, it works with all the techniques from phase 1 and phase 2. So if I've already figured out how to use, for example, Google Bootstrap, and I've already created those grid areas, I can now use FlexBox to control the content in each of those grids. And it massively simplifies the amount of code that you actually have to write. So that's kind of the big thing. Phase 3, it's now simple and flexible. All right, one of the big struggles with traditional CSS, everything was either a block level element or an inline element. And of course you had positioning and things like that. But as a general rule, everything started in the top left corner, and anything you added to the page got shoved to the right or shoved down, whether it was a block or an inline element. With FlexBox, forget those two terms. What we have to do now is think about containers and items. Now, what do I mean? Well, the container, usually a div, doesn't have to be. It could be an ordered list, an unordered, but some kind of container element. And what FlexBox does is let me control the content inside of that container almost like I can in something like PowerPoint. Very little code involved. All right, so very simple page here. Kind of some pseudocode. I have a div, the big kind of aqua container, and then inside of that, I have 3 smaller divs. So that would be the page itself. Now when we go to the style sheet, all I do is I'll give it a class name and display flex. That one property just turned on FlexBox. Well, a big deal. Well, but here's where it gets really cool. I only have to add one more property, and all kinds of cool stuff happens. So if I put in there justify content space around, and this is where it kills me not having a podium in my actual laptop, because I would love to stretch the browser around. So we're gonna have to picture in our mind's eye, as I shrink or expand this window, the alignment will stay consistent on all 3 items. If you've ever tried to do that with traditional CSS, that was a nightmare. That's why people use those sneaky invisible tables. We don't need to anymore. I just say justify content, space around, and as I start to shrink the width of the page, this white space or blue space and this blue space, they will all condense equally. All 3 of my boxes will stay the way they are centered with each other. All Again, it's almost like going into PowerPoint and just saying, you know, align. Another thing that I can do, flex wrap. Again, this is where I would kill to have an actual web browser I could demonstrate with, but I just put display flex, that turns on FlexBox, flex wrap, wrap. Well, if I were to stretch this window larger, number 4 would pop up just to the right of number 3. No special fancy code. If I were to shrink this window, well, number 3 would go where number 4 is, and number 4 would move over. Automatically. No media queries, no 30 lines of CSS code, and if I make this window skinny enough, it'd just be 1, 2, 3, 4 vertically with one property. So that's what I mean by this is like the 3rd generation of responsive design. So much easier, so much simpler. All right, so the 2 properties we just looked at, justify content and flex wrap. There are a few more. We're almost out of time, so we can't go through all of them, but align items. If you've ever tried to align items vertically, for example, that has traditionally been a nightmare. Well, I can actually go in and say, display flex. I'll give my div a height now. This is the blue container. And align items stretch. Guess what? All of my boxes now fill the available space. One property. All right, so my goal with this presentation wasn't necessarily to teach you FlexBox. I mean, that is a course by itself. But what I want you to do is make sure that you know it's available, how powerful it is, and now give you some resources where you can do some further research. All right, so justify, flex wrap, align items we just looked at. There's also align content, flex flow. I can set it up so that when the items wrap, instead of going immediately below, I can end up with space in between. Some boxes could be at the top of the frame, some could be at the bottom of the frame. There's a lot of different property values, and then flex direction. Again, as I start resizing things, I can cause all of those boxes to reorder. Go 4, 3, 2, 1 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, just by changing a property. All right, looks like we're down to 2 minutes. So if you do want to do additional research, w3schools.com, my favorite resource for learning FlexBox your first time out. Now, I have not tested it myself, but I've heard good things about it. Strange name, FlexBoxFroggy.com. What's weird about that, it's a game. And if you play the game, it's supposed to teach you FlexBox. I have not done it myself, but again, I've had good feedback. And this one's a bit longer. You'll probably need to see the video to get this one. But Free Code Camp, if you don't have time, they call this one FlexBox in 5 minutes. It's kind of a crash course into just the fundamentals of FlexBox. All right, so in summary, we talked about what responsive design is, content written once, but it meets all your customer needs no matter what screen they're viewing it on, the core components, document structure, keeping the formatting out, the CSS, controlling the formatting and the media queries, the strategy, thinking in groups or grids, and then the evolution, well, part of CSS now is that FlexBox capability. And I think we've got 1 minute for questions. Boy, I timed that just right. All right, there's a question in the back.
Hi, Mike. Hi, everybody. I'm Wojtek. My question is, because responsive is proven to work very nicely, Do you think the concept of adaptive content, does the responsive supersede adaptive content, or maybe there's still some need or use cases that you think where we could maybe not use entire content, the same content live everywhere, but try to model it more towards the medium? What's your opinion on that?
Okay, the question is about the difference between responsive content and adaptive content. I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I have some very strong opinions. I am a firm believer in that I should control what I get to see. I don't want somebody removing content just because I'm on a phone. Now, depending on the situation, that might be a valid technique. For example, if we go back to Dr. Tony Self's presentation, well, if you're on an airplane, maybe I do need to remove some content so it's not so distracting to a pilot. I mean, maybe that's a valid use case. But as a general rule for me, if I'm on my phone, I don't want to lose content just because I'm on my phone and not my tablet. So I prefer responsive design, but I won't condemn adaptive design. I'm sure there are use cases where it makes sense. Answer the question? Okay, very good. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, that will have to be the last one.
Hi. Yeah, I've got a question about using media queries together with the FlexBox. What's your experience? I know that some guys use it in that way. So, what do you think about it?
All right, what is my opinion of using media queries with FlexBox? Well, first, let me start with it's relatively new. There are still new techniques being developed. What I have done so far, a lot of times I will still use media queries to develop my grid, but then inside of each grid element, I prefer to use FlexBox now to make the resizing more automatic within my media query grids. That does not mean that it's right or wrong. That's my preferred technique right now. But it is still early. That could change a year from now.
Thank you.
All good?
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.